This is Ruțṛell Van Brosklin with my mentor and the university professor that changed my life, Dr. Holmes from SUNY Center of Buffalo. Just want to give you a little bit of background. I went to Buffalo to work with Dr. Holmes, when specifically his intermediate macroeconomics class. I talked to some people and they said they had this absolutely life-changing and amazing experience. And I said, okay. So I went to see Dr. Holmes and he gave us this very interesting final. Explain the Great Depression through a process of thinking causality. And after I went through the class, I was able to rework things. I could finally take what I've learned from his class. I expanded it to finally be able to learn to read at a reasonable rate. And a number of years later, when I was 27, I finally was able to write, expanding his process, which was an A- in a second-year MBA class at Rensselaer Polytech Institute with no assistance. So what I'm looking to do today is I first of all want to discuss with Dr. Holmes what it really takes to get into a top-notch, top 10 graduate program, and then to explore what he went through with dyslexia, what makes his intermediate macroeconomics class just so worthwhile. And then I just want to go over briefly what I created to help students get to the point where they can read academic journal, ask very deep penetrating questions, take it to the professor, who they decide to work with, to then go through the questions and to keep going through that process until the student comes up with a question that the professor can't answer, his colleagues can't answer, the question is worth pursuing according to the senior professor, and the student's interested in it. And that becomes their senior thesis, which then should allow them to get a recommendation, if it's good enough, to a leading graduate program, and to understand that that recommendation is by far the most important thing, not the GRE, not a GMAT, not their GPA, but that recommendation from a senior professor and their ability to contribute knowledge to the field. So that's the purpose for today. So Dr. Holmes, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself, about your life story, what your challenges with dyslexia, about your intermediate macroeconomics class?
Sure. I didn't learn to read until I was 13 years old. I couldn't write my name until the 4th or 5th grade, as I recall. And I'm not sure I've mastered the alphabet yet. They held me back one grade in the 4th or 5th grade, and then they decided that was a mistake because I knew too much. But I couldn't express it in writing. It was all oral. And I've never had trouble expressing myself orally. It was reading and writing that was the bad thing. I graduated from high school, and I was very fortunate. Actually, I had a lot of disciplinary problems in high school. I was suspended 3 times for some very creative things, but they didn't approve of them. One of them was an invention that improved the spitball. This was in Indiana, and farming area, and they have something called a chicken wire staple. You can look it up. And I tried to see how they did with a rubber band, and they were fantastic. I could stick one into a pine board probably 3 out of every 4 shots. And so when I went to study hall, I used my improved technology on a football player who had a large thigh, a worthy target. And usually when they would be poked by this chicken wire staple, it would pop out as they would leap up and scream, and the study hall monitor would then immediately take them to the principal's office. Unfortunately, this one day, this weasel squealed on me and reported what I had done. And I went to the principal's office, and then the superintendent's office, and then I was...
The superintendent?
Oh, yeah. And they suspended me. And my mother went and was in the late spring, and went and negotiated my return to what I considered prison. And how I was sitting in the car, I had these 2 pennies, and I was trying to get I had nothing else to do, to get the shadow of the top one to be on the bottom one. And I spent a lot of time doing that. And most people think that the shadow will be bigger on the bottom penny, but I was convinced it was smaller. And that's correct, because the shadow is cast by the edges of the sun, not the center. You think of it as coming from the center, but you're wrong. And from that, I developed a science fair project to measure the visual angle of the sun. And I won my local science fair contest. By the way, to do this, I had to use 2 meter sticks to measure the shadows. And my science teacher in high school would not lend me the high school meter sticks because he didn't trust me. So I had to pay for them out of my own funds. And I worked in my father's dog hospital, so this was real money. And fortunately, I went on and won the state, and then went to the national science fair, and I won 3rd in the nation there. And that influenced a lot of colleges to let me in, even though I saw no point in taking the SATs because I couldn't possibly pass them.
Oh, you said you thought school was prison. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I've never been to prison, but I learned virtually nothing, and I was a focus of a lot of disciplinary attention, which made me think of it as prison, and I thoroughly disliked it. So anyway, does that answer your question?
Yeah, so what was it, why did you not learn anything?
I couldn't read, I couldn't write, and my learning was all oral. So I learned things orally, but you're tested on what you learn in writing, and I would always fail on that. So I was in the bottom half of my high school class. I was a D or F, sometimes a C student, and then I won 3rd in the nation in the National Science Fair, and everyone would give me A's. I have always had a very general interest. I've been interested in, as an undergraduate, I started 7 different majors. Okay. And I actually graduated with 3 majors. In
what areas?
Well, economics, mathematics, and English. And I kept taking English courses because once I learned to read, I really liked literature. And I was very good at literary criticism, but I couldn't write. And so my English professors would give me 2 grades, one for content in the criticism, et cetera, and the other for the English. And you can guess what the grades for the English were. And that, of course, is the basis for the story that I told you. When I went to graduate, I went to Wabash College in Indiana, and a very good college. It was perfect for me. And the dean called me into his office, and he said, you've got to pick a major for us to give you a degree, because we only you have potentially 3 majors, and we only give a degree in one area. And he told me, because I had the most credit hours in English, I was trying to learn to write, and not very successfully. I also, as I said, I really enjoyed literature. And so he said to me, Jim, if you choose English, we will not give you a degree because you would be too much of an embarrassment to this college. I said, I understand perfectly, and I chose economics. And he was the reason that I was admitted to the University of Chicago. He was an economist and he had been my professor. He recommended, and so did some of my other economics professors, me to Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. And I was...
For those who aren't familiar with Milton Friedman, would you mind just giving a brief background on him?
Milton Friedman was one of the leading economists of the 20th century. He is very famous for being a monetary economist, for advocating free private enterprise. He was one of the stellar professors at Chicago, undoubtedly the best known, and they had quite a few very well-known professors, including George Stigler, for example. But he would then considered more famous and better known, and they actually founded an institute, the Friedman Becker Institute, in his honor.
And he's who you studied under at Chicago?
He's who I studied under at Chicago. But how I got in was the following. As I said, I was recommended by my dean, Ben Roby, and I was invited to be interviewed for this fellowship, the Earhart Fellowship. And they brought in 8 other candidates. I was the farthest west. All the rest of them were from Ivy League schools in the East. And I was interviewed by Milton Friedman, and he was a superb debater, just absolutely. And by the way, in college I was on the debate team and did very well. I really enjoyed it. But of course that's oral. And the thing I have difficulty with to this day is writing and reading. I read very slow. I took a speed reading course, which I ignore pretty much these days. And writing, almost all of my published work is co-authored because I need someone to correct my English and to rewrite what I write. So anyway, he interviewed me, and it was really impressive. He would ask me a question, and I would answer it. Then he had asked a follow-up question, which it was sort of like mousetrapping intellectually. And I would then say, wait a minute, I want to change my answer to the previous question. And so we went, it took about an hour, and I kept correcting my previous answer almost each and every time. And I was really impressed because I clearly understood what he was doing. And he evidently was very impressed with what I was doing because I understood his arguments and where he was going, etc. So I got the Earhart Fellowship. It was the highest, as I remember, it was $5,000 a year in 1959. It was a huge amount of money. And I then went to the University of Chicago without taking the GRE, as I remember, because there was no point. I would fail the GRE just like the SAT. Well, Ben Roby is the one whose recommendation started everything out. So it's because he recommended me to Milton Friedman that started everything. And then when I was interviewed, it wasn't just Milton Friedman. I was interviewed by Ted Schultz, who got a Nobel Prize, and he asked me a question. He said, why do you want to come to the University of Chicago? And I said, I'm not sure I do. And he said, don't you want to get a PhD? And I said, I'm not at all sure. And he said, well, why are you here? And I said, because I think it'd be fun to come to the University of Chicago. And he was shocked. He said, I have never met anyone that thought that the University of Chicago graduate program in economics would be fun. And he said, explain yourself. And I said, well, first of all, I have a job offer from General Motors that is really, really good. And so I'm not sure that if I have fun here, and I really enjoyed Milton Friedman's arguing with me. He's a brilliant man, and I would like to do that again. And yeah, I said, if I learn a lot and am challenged, then I'll keep on. And if I don't, I'm going to go work for General Motors. And that's why I want to come here. And he said, asked me some other questions, and he said, I have a son who's going to Grinnell College, and I only wish he had your attitude. And I realized he would vote for me. So it wasn't just Milton.
No, but so pretty much what I understand, because I know one thing I just want the listeners to understand is for kids today in high school, they're going to either be going to a 2-year college where they're going to get like a head and hands job, education like advanced manufacturing, auto mechanics, nursing, or they're going to go on for a traditional 4-year degree. But with the traditional 4-year degree, that's kind of like a high school diploma when I graduated. They really are going on for most of them for a master's degree. And to get into a master's program, it's not done by the college admissions office. It's done by senior professors. And what I just want to reiterate is how important that letter of recommendation is. Like, as you mentioned, it was the dean of your school?
Yes.
It was the dean who contacted a top professor who then other people interviewed you. That's what's critically important. Not your GPA and GRE are nice, but it's that letter of recommendation and that interaction, which is
absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And let me add, you only get those kind of letters if the professor, the dean was a professor of economics, and if they know you personally. That is, if you have argued with them, if you have interacted with them, then they can write a student a letter of recommendation based on their experience. And that's what you want. And particularly if you're learning disabled, if, like me, the written record is not going to be good, okay, there was nothing good that I wrote that they could cite. And so, as I said, I didn't take the SATs, or if I did, they were totally ignored because I would have set record lows, and the same for the GREs. What got me in was the recommendation of Ben Roby, my dean and professor from Chicago, and what got me into Wabash was I went and interviewed there after I won third in the nation, and they admitted me on the basis of an interview there. So basically, my success academically was in each and every level based upon my oral communication with someone else. And so to get a letter of recommendation, you have to have interacted with that party, that professor. No one ever, take the paradigm of Romeo and Juliet.
Okay.
I undoubtedly commented on and critiqued Shakespeare plays as part of my study of English. I would do that orally with my professor. I'd go to his office and I would tell him what my idea was. He would argue with me, I'd argue with him, I'd expand on it. I could not write a paper that was at all respectable on what I thought. I just could not express it in writing.
But when you argued, did the professor learn something, a new point of view?
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, what he recognized was I was logical, analytical, critical, and damn smart. And when you went to measure that on one of my essays, which I did, they gave me Fs on those consistently through to my senior year. And in fact, when I went to Chicago, I had the same problem. This is before learning disability was recognized as a special thing. So there was no special accommodations for me whatsoever, or for people like me. They gave me special accommodations because, well, I'll tell you the one fact. In a PhD program, you have to take a preliminary exam in a couple or three fields, and the rule is that if you fail two of them, you're out of the program. So I had to take the PhD prelims, and I set a record at the University of Chicago for failing them. I failed 7.
Does that still hold today, or?
I'm confident there's no one that surpassed that record. And so it simply is not true that they evaluated me on the basis of what I wrote.
Nope. Well, okay. So in your case, they learned something, but they learned it with your oral argument instead of done in the written form.
Well, learn, I think, they evaluated my thinking abilities, my critical skills, my logic, my analytical abilities, and that's whether or not they learned something or not, I do not know. I certainly know that they thought very highly of my intellectual abilities. At Chicago, they'd bring in speakers, seminars regularly, and I was considered to be, I would almost always challenge them. After they gave their talk, I asked them questions and try to skewer them. And I often would succeed. And I was considered, there were maybe 2 or 3 professors that were better than me. There were very few that were my equal. Milton Friedman was certainly better than me. He was devastating. But I was right up there.
As a student, as a PhD student,
yeah. And they would notice that because the outside speaker would know when you skewered him, and and that's what I was very intellectually combating. And as I mean, the records show I'm fairly bright, but I cannot express that in writing to this day. I have lots of trouble. And I rewrite things dozens, 100 times because it's bad.
Well, how did you, because I understand you have to write out a dissertation that's hundreds of pages, 1,000 pages. How did you get past that monster?
I would take a draft into my thesis advisor. Milton Friedman was my mentor. Harry Johnson, who was my thesis chairman, and the two of them did not get on very well. So I would take it into Harry Johnson, a draft, and we would go over and he would criticize what I wrote, and I would take notes and mark on it, and he'd give it to me. And the first chapter of my thesis was on Gustav Cassel, an international trade theorist. And I stopped counting when I had the number of times I rewrote that, I believe after the 100th time. And when it was done, he published it in the Journal of Political Economy. He was the editor. So that definitely. Now, how much of that was due just to me, and how much of that was due to Harry Johnson? Harry Johnson made it crystal clear.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought and what my interpretations were and my criticisms were. And of course, it was original, and it was, those were mine. But the way it was expressed, I'll have to give a lot of credit to Harry Johnson.
He was your editor.
He was the editor of the journal, but he was also my thesis advisor. So he's the one that made me rewrite the chapters time after time after time after time. And I think I spent 3 or 4 years completing that thesis.
Wow. How long was it when you finished?
Oh, it wasn't very long. It was maybe 100 pages.
Ah, okay. But I understand. Well, with economics, it's very heavily mathematical and
Right.
formulaic. Where if you're talking history, that's where those big page counts.
Yeah,
come
I
in.
had a lot of math in it, but in the chapter on Ruẓľeľ, it was almost all verbal argument and not oral, but not mathematical.
Okay. Now, just so our listeners can get a better background, from when I came to Buffalo, I was told by numerous people that you were considered one of the top 1% of lecturing, of teaching economists. I mean, that people came to really learn about your contributions. What has your research really primarily been in? What allowed you to really to gain that level of accomplishment in your field?
My research has spanned several areas: international trade, monetary economics, the history of economic thought. In the case of Ruẓľeľ, I'm currently doing research on why firms incorporate, which is, I think, really, really interesting. But those have no relationship to each other at all, as far as I can see. So it's not that I specialize in a small area. I have a very broad set of interests, and I've done a very broad set of research. When I do something, I focus on it intensely. And I think that is essential for someone with dyslexia and ADHD, or whatever it is.
ADD, ADHD. So basically, you mentioned when we were talking before we started recording, one of my big ideas is how students gain epiphanies, those aha moments.
Right.
You mentioned in your case that you tend to think about it, take a nap. Would you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, I'm one of the advantages of being learning disabled is in order to learn, you have to be conscious of how you learn. And I tell my students, when you pick a course to take, you do so on the basis of the professor that teaches it, not on the subject matter. It matters whether or not they connect with you. And a good teacher connects with you. And so I became aware that professors who connected with me had a very consistent way of teaching, no matter what the subject was. They would use paradigms. So they would use, a paradigm is a leading example. So they would give a leading example and then expand on that and abstract and generalize. The usual way to learn is the reverse, and I've never been able to do the reverse. I consciously try to pick a leading example and to think in terms of causality, and I go from the leading example and then create the abstract formulation of it. So I have been aware of how I think, and I would come up with these problems that I'd be working on, and I would come to where I couldn't go any longer. And I realized that I'd often go to sleep. The next morning, I'd wake up and I'd realize I had the answer. When I did my thesis perspectives, this is when I first became very much aware of this. I was working on a problem involving, it was mathematics, it was concerned matrices, and it was generalizing a argument by a PhD student, a former PhD student at the University of Chicago called Theodore Idema, starting with a Y, who later became the vice president or president of General Motors, as I recall. Very bright guy. And his thesis was very mathematical. And I was generalizing it, and I was stumped. And I woke up in the morning, I realized I knew how to answer his question, the problem I was dealing with. And I woke up and I started writing down the mathematics, and I was aware that I had dreamed about it in color. So the mathematics was all done in color. Very bizarre. I've never seen mathematics presented in color. So there was, but I was very aware that my dream was correct. I went and checked the mathematics, etc. And with my conscious, critical thinking ability, but my creative, the creativity came from my subconscious. So I'm convinced that most creativity is done by your subconscious, not your conscious mind. Your analytical, logical abilities may be by your conscious mind, but your creativity comes from your subconscious. So when I have a problem, even in the middle of the day, I'll decide I can't get any farther with this. I'll go take a nap. And often when I wake up, I will have an answer. And so I'm very much convinced that it's, as I said, your creativity comes from your unconscious mind. I think your logical, analytical, critical skills come from your conscious mind.
So basically, your findings is, with your successful career, is to make that aha moment, that your subconscious, you go to sleep, you come up, you make the broad connection, yeah. And then you apply your analytical skills, your paradigm, to then flush it out, right, and to make it coherent.
Right.
And okay, so I think this is a really important part, because some of the people listening are going to be educators. Mm-hmm. And would you mind going into some detail about the traditional form of learning that's done in our schools, how that hasn't worked for you, and to explore more of the causality and how you teach it in your intermediate macroeconomics class, so people can understand the principles and their applications?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. I think that one of the most important things to do is to very consciously try to think in terms of causality. So when you have something that interests you, a paradigm, you want to ask yourself, what are the explained variables, or the explained variable, what are the causal variables? In economics, that is extremely difficult to identify. The causality is very complex, it's not obvious, and that's why there's so much bad economics. And to do this, to identify that, I really think you have to start with a concrete paradigm. Let's take an example. Okay, let's take a paradigm. One of the most important things questions in economics is, does money cause inflation? Does money monetary expansion? That's the current issue the Federal Reserve is dealing with. The way the Federal Reserve deals with it is, and the popular one is, that the Federal Reserve controls the short-term interest rate, the federal funds rate, and then the federal funds rate influences the quantity of money, and then the quantity of money influences the prices people are willing to pay for goods and thereby determines inflation. So that's the paradigm. The way I think about it is I think they've got the causality wrong. I think that what the Federal Reserve does is through open market operations primarily, they vary the quantity of money in circulation. That may or may not influence the interest rate. So it's not that they control the federal funds rate, it's that they control the what's called the monetary base or government issued money. That's what they control. And that may or may not, as I said, influence the federal funds rate. That then does influence people's willingness to pay more or less for goods and services. So this is something that I've researched, and you can look and see what happens to the federal funds rate. Does the federal funds rate appear to be controlled by the Federal Reserve? And the federal funds rate, by the way, is a open market interest rate. It's determined in a competitive market. It's the rate of interest one bank charges another bank for borrowing the excess reserves that they have on deposit at the Federal Reserve. That's what it is. And each of those, they borrow overnight, at most a week or two, but usually it's a part of a day or a whole day is what the length of these loans are. And they do it in order, a bank that does not have enough reserves, if they don't, they can do one of two things, well, three things. They can borrow at the Federal Reserve at the discount window, but that has to be approved by the Federal Reserve. They can borrow from another commercial bank that has excess reserves, that's the federal funds, or they can be penalized, which is the most costly thing, for the Federal Reserve will impose a interest rate penalty on the amount of their deficit in required reserves. So what we're talking about for the federal funds rate is a free market rate, which each and every loan, it can have a different interest rate, and it is not directly controlled by the Federal Reserve at all. That's trivial. They may think that they influence it, but that becomes an empirical question. And I researched that, and every once in a while, you'll see the federal funds rate will be very close to what the Federal Reserve says is their target federal funds rate. And it appears that they do control it, that they do pretty good, except every once in a while, you'll have a big spike up or down of 100 or 200% above what the federal fund target rate is. Well, if you're controlling it, that just refuted that hypothesis, in my opinion. If it goes up 100% above your target, you're not controlling it. Sorry. And now that gives you a very good example of how you think in terms of causality, first of all, and how difficult that is. Two, the role of a paradigm in thinking about these things, and its connection. Paradigms have to be based on some kind of facts. And I've just explained a whole, probably more than you ever wanted to hear, but that explains how I think and how what I think a student should learn. You want to learn how to think clearly, how to analyze things, how to think critically, and you have to use paradigms. You have to think in terms of causality.
Now, with that, one thing that I run against students, and no offense, but I'm come from the pre-iPhone era where attention spans seem to be getting shorter and shorter. One thing that I keep getting kind of complaints with, and I only work with extremely motivated students in general, is this takes so much time.
Right.
So I think one thing that I've learned from you, just correct me if I'm mistaking this in any way, is that when you really want to learn something, you look at how two variables interact at a time.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, even with you can't do three.
Mm-hmm.
You look at two, you see the reaction, you look at the interactions of other variables, you keep connecting variables until after quite a lot of work over quite some time, you glean an insight of importance. That
Mm-hmm.
this takes time,
Right.
it's work, and it's not quick and easy, even for senior professors. Is that right?
I think that's right, but I do think that you think about more than two variables sometimes. You must take the paradigm of the federal funds rate and explaining whether or not the connection between monetary policy and the inflation rate. There are clearly more than two variables.
No, I'm saying you look at two variables, come up with a insight, and look at two additional variables.
Sure.
But if you try to do three at the same time,
Well,
it tends
you're going to end up with three sooner or later.
and then it just makes it more difficult.
Yeah, it makes it more difficult. You do the simplest thing first.
Okay.
And that's the beauty of a paradigm. A paradigm has to be simple. It's called a leading example, but leading is a substitute word, I think, for simple. The simpler it is, the more insightful it will be. And it's very, very difficult to come up with good paradigms because they have to be simple.
Okay. Now, that's how, as I said, you've been successful. That's how you helped a lot of your students. But would you mind going in how the traditional educational system is set up and why you think it's so different?
I think that the usual way that teachers and professors teach is they try to go from the abstract to the particular, instead of, and the particular is a paradigm. It's the reverse way of how our minds work. And that was an insight that I told you about when I realized how I learned. How I learned was from professors who would teach in terms of paradigms. They may not be conscious that that's what they were doing, but that's what they did do.
From the specific to the general.
Because that's what they did. And I would learn from that. And most of them would go from the abstract and the general to the specific, and I could never learn that. And I became very, very conscious about it. That's how I learned. And I think that's the way most people learn.
So if you were locked into just going through the traditional educational system, if you did not get that third place, so let's say you never entered that science competition, what would have happened to you?
I have no idea. I probably would have been an entrepreneur. I may have worked for General Motors. Probably not. But an entrepreneur, I'd probably be running a business.
Okay.
And something like that.
Would you have been able, if you didn't enter your science competition, would you have been able to go to college, or?
Undoubtedly not. I don't think there'd be any possibility. Even when they gave me A's my entire senior year, because they didn't want to give anything less to someone who had won third in the nation in a science fair, I was still in the bottom half of my class. I still couldn't pass an SAT. And our educational system relies upon written evidence. And the way to get around that is to go argue with someone.
Can you tell us a bit more about your intermediate macroeconomics class and why students for generations have said that this is what changed their life? What is so special about this one class?
Yeah, it's my favorite class, and it's pretty much the same every semester. I really enjoy teaching it, and it focuses upon explaining developing a theory of macroeconomics on the basis of causality. And so I start off lecturing on what causality is, and the different views of causality. And I, of course, use paradigms. And then I go to, and part of that is quite simple. Causes must always precede effects in time. So you must have a time structure. And the causal variable has to be conceptually controllable. It may not be actually controllable, but you have to be able to conceive of changing whatever the causal variable is and observing its effect. And I can easily give you a paradigm of that, but any time you think about causality, you should have those two attributes. The cause is conceptually controllable. You can imagine how you would change it, and you can imagine conceptually how that might have an effect, and on different effects for different values of the causal variable. And there has to be a time sequence. And I go to apply that to macroeconomics by developing a theory of how we behave, and I use the natural behavior of students and myself. We have very, very similar motivations. We react to things very much the same way. And, for example, one of the key concepts is called the consumption function. Mm-hmm. So the people's expenditures from their disposable income are either on consumption or they're saved. So you can imagine what factors would influence your choice to consume or save. Well, obviously, it's the disposable income to start with. As we have more disposable income, you're going to increase your consumption. But of course, that depends upon how big the disposable income is. So let's take a paradigm of that. Mm-hmm. Warren Buffett has a very large disposable income. If his disposable income goes up $1, will it influence how much beer or steak he imbibes or ingests? Nah. Zero. So increases in disposable income don't always increase consumption. They would go, in the case of Warren Buffett, totally to his increase in savings.
Especially since the house he lives in is worth, what, $300,000? It's the same house he's lived in for
forever.
Forever, yeah. And as he said, I don't even need all this. You know, it's just, what do I need this big house for?
Right.
And it's an average house.
and that just reinforces the paradigm of what should a consumption function look like. And you can conceive of varying disposable income from little more than zero, in which case you're starving to death. You'll spend all of your income on your consumption and not have enough beer or steak even then, because you'll be starving to death, to having a very large disposable income like Warren Buffett. And here you have a theory of consumption, which I've just built, okay, based on a paradigm of plausible behavior, which everyone can agree with. And that theory of the consumption function is not standard in economics. It's and so you come out with different results, but by going through this, you learn how, hopefully, how to think a different way. And that's what the students really benefit from, and I take great pleasure in doing.
So what I took after I learned your process, and I wanted to solve the reading and writing issues of it. So what I wanted to talk to you now was, I want you to imagine a severely dyslexic student. What is your local school district here? The
Williamsville.
Okay, Williamsville. So let's say this student, and I always try to tell students, my first degree was in economics, is where do you want to end up? Very bright student, and they wanted to prepare. They want to be prepared to come to you for college and to try to work with you to get a good, solid recommendation for Chicago. Just out of curiosity, what's a master's out of the University of Chicago in economics worth now in the employment market?
I don't know. I'm sure that there's statistics on it.
Yeah, but clearly it's a top 10 program.
Yeah, it would be.
Okay. So what I looked at generally is just what I generally found is most of the current kids they have a very specific area that they're interested in, that they like to play in. Mm-hmm. One of the most popular areas that I have, that I've taught numerous times is Walt Disney. The kids go to Disney World and they're like, how did he create all of this? Mm-hmm. So when we came to the writing aspect or the reading aspect, one thing that I found is dyslexics, we have a very hard time with bad writing. Mm-hmm. We only want the best. So I asked them to find a biography from 700 to 1,000 pages that won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer, or some other award. Mm-hmm. Here's Disney's biography. It's called Walt Disney, The Triumph of the American Imagination by Neil Gabler. It took him 7 years to write this monster. Mm-hmm. I asked you to look at it before, and you said this is approximately what grade level?
College level.
Okay. So if we could get a student to thoroughly comprehend this, would that help prepare them to work with?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I generally do with the students is reading. Like, for example, one of my students, her name is Casey. Her parents came to me when she was in 5th grade. Second grade reading level. She's in a rural area of Indiana. Dad's a factory worker, mom's a hairdresser, and they were concerned. So she was interested in Theodore Roosevelt, so I assigned her The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, 920 pages, won the Pulitzer, same reading level as this. And I said, Casey, here's the process. I asked her, first of all, I went over my model. And then I gave her a short process, and 6 months later, with minimum effort on my part, she's thoroughly reading it. What I essentially looked at is, this is a more evolved part of it.
Yeah.
So I simply looked at it, my students, and what I found is, I have a broad interest, but generally a lot of students have a specific interest. Mm-hmm. And they don't like playing outside that area. So yours is very broad. A lot of them are very narrow, but whatever it is, go inside that area. So a lot of students are exceedingly interested in Walt Disney. How did he do this? Mm-hmm. So now that they have this really intense interest, I can give them this massive book, which is over 830 pages. Mm-hmm. And I say, okay, you're going to read this. How am I going to read this? You're going to listen to it while trying to read it, while trying to answer a very specific question. Because this massive activity, what I found is the primary cause of dyslexia is its lack of organization. We just think too quickly and it's too chaotic. So I would ask them 2 questions. Have you ever noticed what you really care about? Fingers, keyboard. Put your fingers on the keyboard. Does the idea that you want to write about just fly out of your head that you care about? For severe dyslexics, they generally say yes. And for everybody that has dyslexia and ADHD, ADD, for the second question, have you found what you care about? You have ideas flying around your head at light speed, but with little to no organization. Yes. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to force your brain to organize through using writing as a measurable output. Reading is the input we process, and then we have the measurable output. So I'll have them go through those 3 activities, and then that scatterbrain tends to drop a lot. And they'll simply, every time they run across a word they don't know, they'll type out the word, go to Merriam-Webster or Oxford English, pick their favorite dictionary, find their favorite definition, type it out. I'll then have them, what I try to tell them is, and you may very well disagree with this, is I try to tell them when they're writing a paper, don't try to do something like what caused World War II. Mm-hmm. That sandbox has been played in so many times, trying to come up with something original in any way. And what I mean by original, I mean something like when you're in a graduate class and you're expected to show up and contribute something, a discussion point, that's kind of what I'm talking about. So I said, don't try to do that. So what I'll have them do is to pick a chapter, and a favorite one that students tend to pick is the creation of Snow White. So what I'll have them do is what I try to do with your causal is I try to take the causal variables at the bottom level and make them the explained variables at the top and stack them. So this is kind of my process with that. What I've noticed is when you're trying to look at a book of this size, like in this chapter, they had about 60 sources that they drew on to write that particular chapter in chapter 6. So I would have them, okay, what's the universal theme? Your what I call the forest. What is your universal theme for the chapter? They'll take a look at it and say, here's my universal theme. I'll say, good, now send it through the thesaurus. Look for because the first word they come up with is very general and broad. What's the best word that has a definition that closely matches what you're trying to say? And they'll go down a couple levels, usually to find then a thesaurus. Then they'll find a quote based on that. And I'll say, okay, on that quote, what's the universal theme? And that's what I call their branch. Run that through the thesaurus. What's that quote? Okay, now what's the equal and opposite reaction of that quote? Put that through the thesaurus, and they'll find an example. Something very specific. So we're taking forest, branch, and leaf. I'll then have them take their leaf quote and their forest quote, put them together, and that's the barrier. So then they'll go through like the 60 examples where this guy got his research to write this chapter, and if it doesn't fall within that narrow parameter, get rid of it. And then I'll have them take, a big part of this is comprehension. So there's two primary universal themes here. One, it's the title of chapter 1, escape. Then I'll tell them, what's the second universal theme? And I swear I'll have parents with master's degree and law degrees go through this and not be able to tell me what the second universal theme is. So there's the ability to read, but then there's the ability to comprehend. And eventually I'll have my students pick up on that. But just for an example, to come up with something worth writing about, take escape through your example, a major universal theme through a specific example, and come up with, now you got something to discuss. Basically, what I said, that's just my general process to get them to organize their thoughts and to come up with something interesting to say. But more importantly, one of the skills that I just think are so important is when I start off, I'll have a student select a chapter before I even decide to work with them. And I'll ask them to read their chapter that they're interested in and to ask deep, penetrating questions. And I find that students with dyslexia tend to do a really good job. When I work with AP English kids, your standard high-performing general education, not general education, non-dyslexic students, I generally find I have to spend an inordinate amount of time explaining to them the basics of how to ask a deep question, where my dyslexic students just pick it up like that, but then my non-dyslexic students will go through 3 or 4 weeks of material in like 30 minutes. They'll just pick it up really quick. So I just noticed that you have that difference. But when they ask those questions, what I'm trying to get is I go not just one chapter, but as I show them this chapter after chapter after chapters to develop the ability to ask very deep questions so that when they eventually come to work with you, what I'm looking for is to hopefully have them maybe contact a professor while they're finishing up high school. Who do they want to work with? And you mentioned one of your favorite journals is the Journal of Political Economy. So imagine, how many times does that come out a year?
12.
12 times. So imagine a student sat down with that. And as I tell them, read it through the first time to get a general idea. Your second time, start asking deep, penetrating questions. And then your third and fourth and fifth time reading it through, try to answer those. The ones you can't answer, bring to your attention. And you're looking for a question that comes up with what I call the following test. You can't answer it. Your colleagues can't answer it. You think it's reasonably important, and they like the question. Once you have that question, then they can spend the remainder years of their college career taking classes to support that question, working on papers, and eventually turning that into a senior thesis that, it's important enough, and try to use that as long as, trying to be a teaching assistant with a professor, helping them on their research, as the foundation of trying to get a recommendation for a graduate program.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So just as we're coming to a close, is there any final thoughts that you can give to students with dyslexia to help them out, or to you
well,
find it effective?
I think that if, in thinking about it, what I did was to basically play to my strengths. And my strengths are the ability to communicate orally. And I suspect that dyslexia increases creativity compared to non-dyslexic. You look at the world a different way. My mind is certainly highly nonlinear. I can go from, contrary to what you said, you try to get people to focus on one narrow thing. When I try to solve a problem, I do that. But my mind goes from one level to another dimension, and that's part of creativity. And I don't think that's a bad thing.